I begin this video today, Tuesday 6th February, with further discussions about the unending saga of the battle between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. Now, yesterday there was a cascade of reports that the decision to remove General Zaluzhny had been finalized at last. The General Zaluzhny had accepted an appointment as ambassador to the United Kingdom, where, by the way, he would presumably be taking over from the current ambassador, who is Alexei Reznikov, the former Ukrainian defense minister, who was once General Zaluzhny's boss, and presumably that there would therefore be an announcement today. Well, as night follows day, today has come. There's been no announcement of General Zaluzhny leaving his post. Instead, we're getting reports that his people have pushed back, that they're saying that there's no truth to the claim that he's agreed to go, and that there's no truth either to the claim that he's agreed to take up the post of ambassador to Britain. So all of the reports yesterday, which were clearly, by the way, sourced from Zelensky's office, well, it turns out today that they were premature, to say the least. This tiresome struggle continues, tiresome to somebody like myself, who has to report continuously a completely unresolved situation, but one deeply alarming, I suspect, to people in the Ukrainian military, and also deeply alarming to the Western powers. And as to that, we've had a very interesting article in the Financial Times, a newspaper which, as I have pointed out in the past, is very close to some people within the Biden administration, who sometimes use it as a sounding board for administration policies. And it is also close to the thinking of the German coalition government and, of course, to the foreign policy establishment in London. It is, in my opinion, one of the most authoritative newspapers around, not in terms of the facts that it supplies, but in terms of understanding what the orthodoxies of the Western foreign policy establishment at any one particular time actually are. Anyway, the article, which begins, has the title, Volodymyr Zelensky pledges to shake up Ukraine's leadership. It then discusses the fact that there's been all of these reports about the dismissal of General Zaluzhny, of a major changes in the entire structure of power in Ukraine. This takes seriously President Zelensky's interview with the Italian media, which I discussed yesterday. I don't take it quite as seriously as the Financial Times does. But anyway, it then goes into the details of the battle between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. And it gives an account of what happened last week, which I'm just going to set out because it's slightly different, though not in essence different, from what we previously heard. So it says that last week, Zelensky met Zaluzhny in a bid to mend ties, but the talks grew heated over the contentious issue of mobilization. Zelensky has questioned the need to conscript 500,000 new troops, which Zaluzhny allegedly called for, a figure the general later denied having floated. A draft bill on the issue continues to be hotly debated in Ukraine's parliament. Before the meeting ended, Zelensky informed the general that he planned to replace him according to 4 people with knowledge of the meeting. 2 of the people said Zelensky had made clear to Zaluzhny that regardless of whether he took on a new role, he would be removed from his current position. Now that is somewhat interesting, and it confirms how deeply controversial and what an immensely hot potato the question of the new mobilization law has become. According to this account, the meeting between Zelensky and Zaluzhny on Monday last week was not initially about Zelensky telling Zaluzhny that he would be dismissed. It was about Zelensky coming to meet Zaluzhny to try to get Zaluzhny finally to come out and publicly support the mobilization law, which Zaluzhny supposedly originally asked for. And apparently, Zaluzhny refused. He did what he has always done in the past. He insists on the mobilization law in public, but he's not prepared to argue for it he insists on the mobilization law in private, but he is not prepared to argue for it in public. He's worried about the effect on his popularity if he does, and he's worried about the wider impact on Ukrainian society. I've said that this is very characteristic of Zaluzhny's behavior right from the time when he first became Ukraine's military commander-in-chief back in July 2021. He has been sedulous in protecting his public image and has not been averse to spreading negative stories about his political superiors, even and repeatedly gives the impression that he's less than enthusiastic for particular actions, be it Ukraine's counteroffensive of last year or the mobilization this year, which, however, it is clear that he actually backed in private. Anyway, he comes out, plays this duplicitous game, refuses to accept responsibility, and Zelensky, understandably, became utterly exasperated. And as the meeting became more and more heated, in other words, as the 2 men started to argue and voices were raised, Zelensky finally told Zaluzhny that he was out, that he would be sacked. He demanded Zaluzhny's resignation, and Zaluzhny refused. And then Zelensky said, well, in that case, I'm going to have to sack you. And again, Zaluzhny apparently dug in his heels and said, if you want to sack me, go ahead and try. And then the article goes on to say, the 2 people said that Zelensky had offered Zaluzhny other jobs, such as leading the country's National Security and Defense Council or the role of ambassador in the United Kingdom, but Zaluzhny declined them. And then we're told about how Zaluzhny has since then gone out of his way to make himself public. He's posted photographs of himself. He's written a long article, opinion piece for CNN, talking about the need for a technological transformation of the way the war is conducted, but also implicitly criticizing Zelensky for not carrying through the mobilization plan, which Zaluzhny refuses to publicly back. And then we read all about that. And then the Financial Times tells us that the change of command would come at a critical juncture in the war, as Russia started the year with unprecedented barrages aimed at overpowering Ukraine's air defenses, and with Ukrainian forces rationing weaponry, which allies have struggled to supply at the rate needed on the battlefield. Ukraine's Western partners are nervous about the looming shake-up, according to two Western officials from G7 nations whose governments provide arms to Ukraine. One said they were apprehensive because of Zaluzhny's popularity among Ukraine's rank-and-file soldiers, as well as the general population, which could lead to a backlash when unity is crucial. And it remains unclear who would replace Zaluzhny, but the four people with knowledge of the matter told the Financial Times that leading candidates were Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, and Lieutenant General Kirill Budanov, head of the country's military intelligence directorate, the GUR. Syrsky, 58, an experienced commander, is seen as a close ally of Zelensky, who has brought him along on several frontline visits and photo opportunities with the troops. However, Syrsky is widely disliked amongst Ukraine's rank-and-file soldiers, who say that he has made decisions that unnecessarily caused the loss of precious weapons and ammunition, as well as lives. An interesting admission from the Financial Times that Syrsky is unpopular with the troops. I'm just saying. Anyway, we then go on to read that Budanov, 38, does not have the experience of Zaluzhny and Syrsky as an army commander. That's an understatement. As I said, he has no experience of commanding men in battle at any level whatsoever. And I should say that on the Duran, Glenn Deason and I have just done an interview with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, formerly of the U.S. Armed Forces, a military officer who has led men in battle. He led them in battle in 1991 against Saddam Hussein's army, and he provides there a very vivid description of the intellectual challenges of command on the battlefield and the importance of that for a senior officer. That a senior officer who doesn't have that experience, that kind of background, that sort of training, which takes years to acquire, how an officer who lacks those things is basically incapable of fulfilling command. So any appointment of Budanov would put in effect someone in charge of the Ukrainian armed forces who has no ability to command them in a conventional war. But of course, that's not what the Financial Times says. It says that he does not have the experience of Zaluzhny and Syrsky as an army commander, but he has been effective in his role of leading the GUR. This is the intelligence arm of the Ukrainian military, revitalizing the agency which has long played second fiddle to Ukraine's much larger domestic security service, the SBU. And again, I've already said in previous programs that I personally disagree with that view. I think that Budanov has been effective in a kind of a way in organizing covert operations and what some might call terroristic episodes behind Russian lines. But as an intelligence officer, as someone who you would look to provide you with a sense of what is happening on the other side, how many troops the other side has, what its forces are, what the plans of its military leadership are. If you're looking to Budanov to provide you with that information, you would be bitterly disappointed because he's not interested in that kind of thing and is, in fact, a terrible intelligence officer. Just saying. But anyway, we then go on to read that Budanov's famously brazen tactics, that's a euphemism for his terroristic activities, if I can use that phrase, have put Kiev's Western partners on edge. He makes us nervous, one of the Western officials said. Nervous is probably an understatement, because not only does he engage in these covert operations, which are controversial, to say the least, and completely misguided, in my opinion, but coming back to what I said, he is completely incapable of providing the Ukrainian military with the leadership it needs in the kind of existential struggle it is now engaged in with the much bigger and much more heavily, powerfully equipped and professionally led Russian armed forces. And then the Financial Times says that two people close to Syrskyi and Budanov told the Financial Times last week that they were uninterested in the post, preferring to remain in their current roles. And Mick Ryan, whom I will return to, by the way, he's written an interesting article for Foreign Affairs. Mick Ryan, a retired Australian Army Major General and military strategist, warned against the perception of instability that Zaluzhny's ousting could generate. There may be some, particularly in the US Congress, who could exploit a change in the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces and any public fallout afterwards as additional evidence for why they shouldn't support further packages of US assistance for Ukraine. And US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told CBS on Sunday that the White House had been notified by Kiev of the looming changes, but would not weigh in one way or another. The latter, by the way, I think we can disregard. They are undoubtedly concerned and they are undoubtedly involved. It cannot be otherwise. Again, I will return to all this shortly. But there it is. Coming back to what I said previously, reports yesterday that Zaluzhny had agreed finally to go and would be packing his bags and taking up the ambassadorship in London, immediately contradicted today with people close to Zaluzhny insisting that he intends to remain where he is. And unclear who is going to take over from him. General Syrskyi, possibility, but he's unpopular with the rank and file. And Budanov, a real possibility perhaps, but someone who makes the West, or at least some people in the West, nervous, because he's obviously incapable of command, never having commanded so much as a platoon of troops in actual battle, and also because of his habits of engaging in all kinds of covert operations, which have achieved absolutely nothing of value for Ukraine, but which have caused a great deal of embarrassment to Ukraine's NATO sponsors. So that's where we are, still an unresolved situation. I don't think it will remain unresolved forever. And again, I've had a very interesting report, a commentary from a source who's provided with much information in the past. This information comes mostly from Russian sources. I mean, I'm obtaining this information at second hand. But it says that the Russians appear to think that there's been a long-standing dispute within the United States, within the US government, about how to handle the conflict in Ukraine. That right at the outset of the war, it was expected that the CIA would be running the operation, and basically that it would be an insurgency type operation, against the Russians once they had occupied Ukraine. But then subsequently, as it became clear that the war would take a more conventional character, the Pentagon, with its own ideas, began to insert itself, and over the course of 2022 took charge. And it says that the leading figure was General Milley, and General Milley played a critical role in putting together Ukraine's summer offensive of last summer, and that he had even more ambitious plans for the offensive than has been announced, and that he did indeed want Ukraine to be supplied with long-range ATACMS missiles and fighter jets and all that kind of thing. Completely unclear to me, by the way, how Ukraine would have been able to operate F-16 fighter jets soon enough for them to participate effectively in the summer offensive. Their delivery has again apparently been postponed, with the fundamental problem being that the Russians are able to launch missile and bomb strikes against Ukrainian airfields, making operation of the F-16s, which require large, clean, well-protected airfields, all but impossible. And there's even a report circulating that President Zelensky is now in contact with the Moldovan leader, Maria Sandu, trying to persuade her to open Moldovan airspace to Ukraine. And the suggestion is that the plan is that the F-16s will be based either on Romanian or conceivably Moldovan territory, hopefully out of reach of Russian missiles, and that will finally enable them to participate in the battle. I'm not convinced, by the way, that this exchange with Maria Sandu is really taking place, but I do believe that problems with training pilots and getting the airfields in a condition to operate the F-16s is proving a major obstacle towards their deployment. But anyway, coming back to what I was saying, I don't myself see how, given all the problems with the deployment of F-16s, it would have been possible to supply them to Ukraine last year early enough for them to participate in the counteroffensive of the summer. I would have thought that the obstacles to doing that would have been overwhelming. But anyway, apparently Milley, maybe now he's going around telling everybody that yes, he was fully in support of this offensive in the summer, but he wanted it to be backed with F-16s and ATACMS missiles, and it was the failure to supply these weapons which explains why the offensive ultimately failed, which is, by the way, the same excuse that Zaluzhny is giving. And anyway, the offensive did fail. It was comprehensively defeated. The attempt to launch a secondary offensive in the autumn across the Dnieper into the Kherson region has also dismally failed. It too has been defeated. We'll come to that shortly. And as a result, there's been further debate and argument within the US government about what to do. And the administration is gradually shifting back to its original position of taking control of the war away from the Pentagon and transferring it back to the CIA as the original plan for an insurgency war again begins to take hold. Now, again, I want to stress I'm getting this all from a source who's getting it from the Russians, who probably and presumably getting information from the CIA, from the West, from the United States, No doubt they do have their sources of information there. I don't know how reliable all this is, but it is intriguing, and it might again explain why we are seeing Budanov's star increasingly in the ascendant. That the view is that a general who thinks in terms of conventional war, like Zaluzhny, is no longer suited to the kind of war that is coming. And since eventually the Russians are going to break through the Ukrainian defense lines, and we're going to engage in an insurgency war instead, the time has come to put someone at the head of the Ukrainian armed forces who can perhaps start to prepare those armed forces for that kind of struggle. There are units like Azov and Aidar and all of these who perhaps might provide the foundational cadre for an insurgency in Ukraine. And Budanov, with his particular ideological beliefs and his gift, if I can put it that way, for covert operations, is the ideal person to lead them. And that, of course, would be very close to the kind of thing that the CIA has done in the past. They did that, for example, in Afghanistan, and they did that in the 1980s, and they did that in Syria, without any success there, by the way, or at least with, it ended at any rate, it ended in failure in Syria. But at least it's something that they know how to do and have done before. And to be frank, if this is the thinking, and if this is what ultimately lies behind all these moves to shift Zaluzhny and to replace him with Budanov, it would not completely surprise me. But anyway, all of this continues, as, by the way, does all the debates about the mobilization law, which is stuck in the Ukrainian parliament. Nobody seems to be prepared to take full responsibility for this law. And Yulia Tymoshenko, former Prime Minister of Ukraine, once one of its most powerful political figures, now someone who has gradually emerged as a critic of President Zelensky, a person who's been talking about the need for Ukraine to consider a plan B, though she hasn't said what that plan B would be, but somebody who clearly senses the fragility in the political situation and who could conceivably put herself forward to take charge if things begin to get really bad at some point over the next few weeks or months. Anyway, she's now come out and said straightforwardly again that she's now seen the draft mobilization law. It is terrible. It would be an absolute disaster if it was implemented in the form that is being proposed. What Ukraine needs is not another conscript military, but a fully professional army. That's true, but it's also a completely demagogic statement. How would Ukraine create a professional army at a time like this, in the middle of a war? The time scale to do that simply does not exist. But anyway, she has made clear her strong opposition to the law, and obviously she's acting opportunistically. But one senses that she feels that she has the wind of popular support behind her as she makes these moves. My own view about Tymoshenko is that she does very much want to become president of Ukraine. This has been her consuming ambition for at least the last decade and a half. And I personally would not be surprised if in the event that she does somehow manage to claw her way to the top and become president of Ukraine, if she decides that Ukraine needs some kind of ceasefire with the Russians and opens negotiations to try to achieve that. There's been much speculation in the West about General Zaluzhny doing something like that if he takes over from Zelensky. I personally think that is extremely unlikely. Zaluzhny comes across to me as a nationalist hardliner who's most closely associated with the most hardline nationalists on the Ukrainian political scene. For them, of course, negotiations with the Russians are anathema, and I think it most unlikely that Zaluzhny would turn round and go against his own beliefs and those of his most close allies and political backers and open negotiations with the Russians. By contrast, Tymoshenko, were she able to take over, which I have to say, I think is extremely unlikely. I think she might be prepared to do that, or at least try to do that, if only to buy time. But anyway, I don't want to spend more time discussing the political ambitions of Yulia Tymoshenko, who I don't think, to be frank, is going to play a significant role in Ukrainian politics going forward. So there we go, a very, very controversial law, draft law in the parliament. Zaluzhny straightforwardly refusing to support it. Ukrainian public opinion apparently deeply unsettled by rumors about this law and opposed to it. And President Zelensky, lacking Zaluzhny's public support, unwilling to move forward with this law, despite the fact that every report from the Battlefront says that the Ukrainian army is exhausted, that it is desperately short of ammunition, that the military units are operating at around 50 to 60% manpower of their designated manpower, and that the situation on the battlefronts is becoming increasingly critical. So, an unresolved crisis in Kiev, possibly an ongoing battle in Washington between the Pentagon and the CIA. I mean, that seems to be plausible enough. Maybe ideas circulating in Washington about mounting an insurgency war. That seems to be the situation at the moment in Kiev. Let me reiterate again my own view. An insurgency war in Ukraine would be a disaster, compounding the misery and suffering that the Ukrainian people have been experiencing after these long years of war, and on top of which, I'm far from convinced that most of Ukrainian society would willingly support an insurgency of that kind, and with the Russians, of course, probably already making the preparations to counter it. And secondly, I am deeply opposed to this further mobilization law. I read a deeply upsetting article in the London Times several days ago about Ukraine's demographic situation. It essentially corroborates points made earlier by Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama about Ukraine's disastrous demographic situation. It said that male life expectancy in Ukraine has fallen to 57, making it, I believe, the fifth worst in the world. that the population growth rate in Ukraine, the birth rate in Ukraine, has collapsed to catastrophic levels. It is now the worst, apparently, in the world. There are no babies being born in Ukraine, which is completely unsurprising, given the situation there. It spoke about how millions of people have left Ukraine and that the population now might be no more than 25 million. And it spoke about the fact that the cohort of young men who might conceivably be fit for conscription into the war, the cohort of young men in their 20s and 30s, is disastrously small, which no doubt, by the way, explains why when it began its mobilizations back in 2022, Ukraine only conscripted men above the age of 27. There just aren't enough 20-year-olds to do this, to conscript in sufficient numbers to make a difference on the battlefield. And the London Times article went on to say that the demographic catastrophe Ukraine has experienced over this war is potentially existential for Ukraine, and that any future Ukrainian government which tries to rebuild the country in peacetime would have to try to increase the population in Ukraine by attracting huge numbers of migrants, and there were suggestions that they might come from Eastern Europe and Central Asia and places like that. Something which the article acknowledged would completely transform the character and culture of Ukraine from what it is at present. I have to say, reading an article like that, it massively reinforced my strong beliefs that a further mobilization of 500,000 men drawn from the smallest demographic, or one of the smallest demographics, but one of the demographics that is most essential for the future of Ukraine as a nation, would be a catastrophe. And given that what would happen is that all of these young men would have to be thrown into battle with only minimal training. And again, that program we did, Glenn Deason and I, with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, explains how important training is for soldiers to work successfully on the battlefields. Anyway, having a further mobilization which ends up throwing poorly trained young men into the furnace of the Ukrainian battlefield would, in my opinion, be an error bordering on a crime. It would not change the eventual outcome of the war. It would simply compound the demographic catastrophe Ukraine is already experiencing. I just wanted to make those 2 points so that people are clear about what I think. No, I'm clear in my own view that the right thing for Ukraine to do, the right thing for Ukraine's leadership to do, if they care about their people and about the future of Ukraine, is to find some way to end the war and to agree peace. But of course, there's no suggestion that anyone in authority in Kiev is interested in doing anything like that. Anyway, that now leads me back to the situation on the battlefronts. And the last 24 hours, we've had more grave news for Ukraine in Avdeyevka. It seems that the Russians are capturing more territory, and it looks as if they are working now towards their goal, what appears to be their goal. I'm taking all this from, obviously, military reporters on the ground, both Ukrainian and Russian. There is a general consensus between the Russian and Ukrainian reporters about the direction of events in Avdeyevka. There's been a rare degree of consensus about the ongoing collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Avdeyevka. Normally, throughout this war, one has got differing accounts of the progress of a battle from Russian and Ukrainian sources. But on this occasion, the Ukrainian sources appear to mirror very closely what the Russians are saying. Anyway, the consensus of reports says that the Russians are gaining more control of more territory, both within and around Avdeyevka all the time. They're close to encircling the filtration plant. They're close to encircling other Ukrainian positions in other parts of the battlefronts. And most seriously of all, they're coming very close now to their objective of driving through Avdeyevka, cutting the town in two, severing the main road, preventing supplies being sent to the Ukrainian forces trying to defend their positions in the south of Avdeyevka. And the Ukrainians have apparently deployed large numbers of men and machines, tanks, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and such things to try to reverse the situation in Avdeyevka. They seem to be having only very limited success in doing that. In fact, if I have to be honest, I don't see that they're having, at the moment, any success at all. And it seems to me that throwing more men into Avdeyevka not only is increasing their losses, but perhaps more dangerously, it is increasing the possibility that larger numbers of Ukrainian troops will be cut off in the south and central parts of Avdeyevka, and that we will have a Mariupol-type situation start to develop in Avdeyevka. I am not sure that that will happen, but I noticed that Dima at the Military Summary channel was talking about the possibility of a cauldron developing in Avdeyevka and pointing out that the Russians are very close to the points now, where if they capture those points, a cauldron might occur. But with the chaos in Kiev, with uncertainty on the part of Ukrainian commanders, it's unclear to me what exactly it is that the Ukrainians propose to do. And if the news from Avdeyevka is bad, it needs to be stressed again that the news is bad pretty much everywhere else. There's been more Russian attacks south of Avdeyevka in the Marinka area. I say the Marinka area, that this is now becoming quite a broad front. The Russians seem to be advancing in multiple directions and from multiple axes here, and not necessarily just from Marinka itself, but the Russians seem to be undertaking a large-scale advance here. There's pictures of what appears to be long-distance shelling of Ukrainian positions, and very intense shelling by ultra-long-range Russian artillery. Some suggest that this could be the work of the new 152 Koalitsiya SV self-propelled guns, which Shoigu complained had not yet been brought into service, but which apparently now have been. But I noticed that the Russian Defense Ministry published a report talking about the effective use on the battlefronts of the 203 millimeter Maidka self-propelled gun, a legacy system from the Soviet Union, which also has extremely long range. And it could be that it was this gun, or rather these guns, plural, that are being used that were being used in this operation, and which were carrying out these long-range strikes. And that's the situation in the Marinka area. Reports that parts of Novomikhailovka, this village to the south of Marinka, has now been captured, that Ukrainian troops are facing a critical situation in Novomikhailovka. We've heard that before, but it does seem from the various maps that people are drawing that the Russians have now created a very tight ring around Novomikhailovka, and as I said, other reports that the Russians are advancing in multiple directions from Novomikhailovka. And very heavy shelling and drone attacks and bombing raids by the Russians in the Bakhmut area. And also in the Liman area, where there are more reports of growing Russian advances as the Russians push relentlessly towards the Zherebets River, with the Ukrainian defenses being very disorganized there. And we've heard less from Kupiansk, but there are reports that after the big advances in the south, around Avdeyevka and other villages to the southwest of Kupiansk, that the Russians are making another very powerful attack this time, aimed at capturing Sinkovka, this village to the west of Kupiansk, which is on a hill, or at least an area of high ground. The Russians have struggled to capture this village up to now, but there are reports that they are now on the brink of doing so. Well, we shall see. And last but not least, there's also been apparently intense fighting around a village called Belogorovka in northwest Lugansk region. It's the only part of Lugansk region that the Ukrainians control. The Russians captured it for a time, as I remember, in 2022, when they announced that the entirety of Lugansk region was back under their control. And then the Ukrainians were able to recapture Belogorovka over the course of their successful Kharkiv offensive of the autumn of 2022. But now the Russians are back in renewed force. It seems that the attack on Belogorovka is extremely powerful. And I think most people who are monitoring the news take the view that Belogorovka will soon be recaptured by the Russians. And, of course, the capture of Belogorovka opens the way for an advance on Siversk from the east. The Russians control Veseloye and are apparently working to attack Siversk from the south. The Russians are also present north of Siversk. Siversk would face a concerted attack, eventually could face a concerted attack, eventually from multiple directions. One of the reasons the Russians weren't able to capture Siversk in the summer of 2022 is that Russian forces at that time were only able to attack Siversk from the north and east, but with a further attack on Siversk potentially from the south, it's likely that the town this time will fall. Anyway, that's all some distance away. I'm going to say something else. I've been following the course of the war now, since it began in February 2022. And I'm going to say that there has never at any point in the war been as much intensity in Russian military operations as we are seeing at the moment. The Russian Air Force is now active in every part of the front lines. Wherever one looks, there's heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force. The Russians are dropping these precision-guided bombs in ever greater numbers, and those bombs are becoming more accurate and more powerful. And we see heavy bombing in Avdeyevka, in the Marinka area, in the Bakhmut area, around Siversk, in Liman, in all sorts of places. And of course, even in places like Kherson as well. The Russian Air Force is now active to an extent that it has never been. And to all appearances, the Ukrainian air defense system is no longer functioning. It is no longer able to challenge these Russian aircraft to any extent. It's as if the skies over eastern Ukraine have fallen entirely under Russian control so that they are able to bomb at will. It's beginning to look, it's not yet fully achieved, but it's beginning to look like the kind of bombing campaign that one associates more with the US Air Force than with the Russian Air Force, as it has performed in this war up to this time. And Russian shelling is intensifying as well. Now, again, I don't know the exact number of shells that the Russians are firing on any particular day. The last claim I saw was that the Ukrainians are firing 2,000 shells a day. I think that is perhaps an overstatement. The Russians are firing supposedly around 10,000 shells a day, 5 times more. My sense, again, is that as compared with the start of this year, Russian shelling is becoming more intense once more, that the Russians are shelling more and more positions with ever greater levels of intensity. And there's been reports circulating in the West that with Ukrainian counter-battery fire practically at an end, that is to say, the Ukrainians have run out of shells, and by the way, artillery pieces. Many of their guns are now worn out and can no longer fire. Western guns have proved much more fragile over the course of the war than has been the case recently. Anyway, with Ukrainian counter-battery fire almost at a stop, the Russians have been able to do again something that they were only able to do for a certain period during the war, most notably in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk fighting, which is concentrate their artillery in bunches, causing artillery barrages to be brought down on the Ukrainians on a simply monstrous scale. And this is apparently increasingly starting to happen. And it is not because the Russians are becoming cocky. It is because they clearly have an abundance of shells to fire, and because they are confident that Ukrainian counter-battery fire has been, at least for the time being, suppressed. There's an awful lot of talk, by the way, about the latest wonder weapon that the Ukrainians are receiving, the small rocket-launched, the rocket-launched rather small diameter bombs. This is a lash-up created by Raytheon and Saab in Sweden. It's a new rocket, basically, that can be launched from the HIMARS system. It has a somewhat longer range than the HIMARS rockets. The bombs themselves carry apparently a relatively small explosive charge, and I've heard that the bombs are actually rather slow when they approach their targets. Presumably they become detached from their rockets, which makes them different from the HIMARS rockets, so that they then fall to the ground and they become easier potentially to detect and presumably shoot down. And that might be make them vulnerable to parts of the Russian air defense system. It could be that once these weapons, these small diameter rocket launched bombs, become more widely available, that could enable the Ukrainians to engage in more counter-battery fire. We shall see. But I would say that the Russians also, over the last few weeks, appear to have resumed their hunt for HIMARS launch systems, and they appear to have, at least according to their claims, destroyed quite a few. So the number of HIMARS vehicles that Ukraine has probably reduced, and though the United States could potentially supply Ukraine with more, that in turn will presumably depend, at least to some extent, on congressional authorization for more aid to Ukraine. So it could be that these small diameter bombs are not going to make quite the difference that people expect. And even if they are deployed, I suspect that the Russians will rapidly adapt to them and find means of countering them, and will do so in a relatively short time. So anyway, very heavy bombing by the Russians, very, very heavy shelling by the Russians, very active use by the Russians of FPV and Lancet kamikaze drones right across the battlefronts. More evidence that the Russians are using armored vehicles to launch their attacks. As I said, they seem to me to be operating at levels of intensity that I have never seen being used by the Russians at any previous point in this war. When the Russians previously went on the offensive in the summer of 2022 or in the spring of 2023, in the first case against first Mariupol and Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and also in the spring of 2023 against Bakhmut, when they conducted offensives previously, it was notable that they were attacking basically in only one place at a time. Mariupol, then Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, then Bakhmut, and everywhere else they remained basically static and on the defensive. This time, they seem to be attacking right across the conflict line, and doing so with ever greater levels of intensity. And I get the sense that that intensity is increasing almost by the day, and certainly by the week and month. So it is greater now, much greater now than it was, say, in December, and no doubt that trend will continue. So, a difficult situation for Ukrainian forces on the battlefront, probably an increasingly critical one. And I would like here to make a number of two observations. The first observation, and it really stems from a very recent video that Brian Belletti did at the New Atlas. He describes in that video how the West pulled together all the artillery ammunition that they had for Ukraine's summer offensive. That is absolutely true, by the way. And doing that is what, to a great extent, explains Ukraine's artillery shortages now. Fact is that the United States and its allies had only a limited number of artillery shells, and their production, as now everyone acknowledges, is not coming remotely close to meeting Ukraine's needs or even to replenish those arsenals. And that ought to have been apparent, in my opinion, already in the winter and spring of 2023. So, given the shortages in ammunition and in other types of equipment, what Ukraine needed to do then was to conserve its ammunition stocks, because expending them on an all-or-nothing offensive would put Ukraine in a disastrous situation if the offensive was defeated. The offensive was defeated, and it is because the ammunition stock was exhausted over the course of that offensive. That is one of the key reasons why Ukraine is in the critical situation that it is in today. Ukraine burnt itself out over the course of the summer. It suffered enormously heavy losses in trained manpower and shells and advanced equipment. And the result is that it is no longer in a position to withstand these Russian attacks, which are taking place right across the conflict line and which are becoming more powerful. That is one point I want to make, and it's not one, by the way, that you see articulated to any great extent in the media in the West. And the second comes back to the point about FPV drones. Now, we've been hearing a great deal over the last few weeks about how FPV drones, Ukraine's FPV drones, somehow make up for Ukraine's shortage in artillery. I've expressed my profound skepticism about this in several videos now. Brian Beletic does the same in his latest program. He points out that the Russians have now far outpaced Ukraine in use of FPV drones, which is true. I'm going to say, however, something else, which is that over the last couple of days, again, this is an impression rather than a quantifiable fact, but over the last couple of days, it's been noticeable to me, or at least I get the impression, that Ukrainian use of FPV drones, the number of FPV drone attacks that Ukraine is undertaking, seems to be in steep decline. Now, that could be because the Russians have successfully tracked down Ukrainian FPV drone operators. They've been hunting for them for a while. Or it could be that there are problems in Ukraine with producing FPV drones. Or it could be that I'm just getting this wrong and that the number of FPV drone attacks is the same as always, and I'm just getting a mistaken impression. But I suspect that the underlying reason, the ultimate cause, is that the Russians are proving more successful in jamming these drones, and that this is negating Ukraine's success in this area. So, just saying. Now, there have been some other very interesting articles circulating about the general situation in the West. And I've discussed many times how the West launched this economic war against Russia, which there's no sign that it is successful. The IMF is predicting Russian growth of 2.6% this year. We've had a PMI figure from Russia for January. It shows a slight decline. The previous PMI figure for December was 56.2. In January, it fell to 55.8. That still points to a very strong expansion. I would say that services, PMI and services, one would expect a decline given the high interest rates. And also, of course, in December, there might have been a further upward pressure on PMI in services because of the gift buying in advance of the Christmas and New Year holidays. But anyway, there we are. Still a strongly positive reading. It suggests that the Russian economy continues to expand. And no sign, therefore, that the Russians are losing their ability to sustain their enormous increases in production, weapons production, for the war. But there's also been a very interesting article, at least I found it an interesting article, by Mick Ryan, former Australian Major General, the man I mentioned earlier in the programme, who was worried about the news about Zaluzhny's dismissal. Anyway, Mick Ryan has written for Foreign Affairs, one of the three big magazines on foreign policy that are published in the United States and which the foreign policy establishment there goes to. And he said that the Russians are now starting to out-innovate the Ukrainians. Now, I think the claim that the Ukrainians were better at innovating than the Russians has always been something of a myth. It's probably true that at the start of the war, in fact, it's undoubtedly true that at the start of the war, the Ukrainians had more drones and more drone operators than the Russians. But this was probably a product of the fact that Ukraine has actually been engaged in conflict in Donbass much longer than the Russians. The Russians only intervened in February 2022, whereas fighting in the Donbass began in earnest, as I remember, in April 2014. So it's unsurprising that the Ukrainians perhaps were ahead of the Russians in drone warfare and certain other types of innovations. But Mick Ryan makes the point that the Russians have not only caught up, but are surpassing the Ukrainians. And he points to the systematic character with which the Russians are able to extend innovation across their entire armed forces, by contrast with the much more improvised way that the Ukrainians are able to do the same thing. And he gives all kinds of reasons for this, and I should say straight away that there's a lot in this article with which I don't agree with, but about the overall principle, I think this is correct. And he mentions differences in culture, which, again, I don't take particularly seriously. The reason this is so is because the Russians are able to do things industrially, whereas the Ukrainians can only improvise, this is my opinion, on a hand-to-mouth, homemade kind of basis. The Russians, of course, have a far more elaborate and integrated command structure as well than the Ukrainians do, where command is, to put it mildly, fragmented, and as we have seen with the conflict between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, increasingly chaotic. But it explains why the Russians are able to overtake Ukraine in drone warfare, in electronic jamming, in sector after sector, and are becoming more advanced than the Ukrainians on the battlefields every day. The mass use by the Russians of precision-guided bombs, hardly evident at the start of the war, is of course perhaps the most striking single example. And this goes back to another issue which we discussed, Glenn Deason and I, with Lieutenant Colonel Davis in our program with him, which, as I said, you will see you can find shortly on the Duran. And that is that there is this colossal mismatch of resources. The Russians can commit resources to resolving any particular problem that they face on the battlefronts to an extent that Ukraine can never even imagine. And just as it is inconceivable that Ukraine can construct fortified lines comparable to the Surovikin line in anything like the time frame people are talking about, and under the reign of Russian missiles and bombs, so it is impossible for the Ukrainians to match Russian technical and industrial innovations in any other field. Now, there are, of course, contrary views. David Axe at Forbes, heroic believer in Ukraine's eventual triumph, tells us that Russian armor losses are so enormous that the Russians will finally run out of armor in 6 months. I mean, I've heard this many times about missiles, about shells, about every conceivable type of military equipment. I can remember that way back in 2022, when T-62s and T-55s were appearing, people were saying that the Russians were soon going to run out of tanks. It turned out otherwise. But, David Axe, he's welcome to believe that if he wishes. I think all of the evidence points clearly in completely the opposite direction. And of course, there continue to be those who say that technologically, the Russians will not be able to sustain the war either, that Western sanctions are going to defeat the Russians, that they won't have the advanced chips that they need to maintain the war, and things of that kind. On that issue, that last issue, I've received a very interesting email again from someone who, again, I'm not going to identify who this person is, but he's actually discussed photos that have appeared of Russian Kh-101 drones, which have fallen to earth, have been either shot down or, anyway, relatively intact specimens have appeared in Ukraine. And he's pointed out that they are a fascinating mixture of old and new technology. The Russians are apparently able to produce extremely advanced cruise missiles, utilizing microchips, which were originally developed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And they're able to use these microchips alongside some extremely advanced technology indeed, so that these Russian weapons are hybrids of equipment, of technologies from different technological ages. Whereas, by contrast, when the United States tries to produce a system, it tries to ensure that every technological component belongs to the same generation, even if, say, an older, simpler chip for a particular application would do the job just as well. And obviously that increases the cost of American systems, but it doesn't necessarily increase their effectiveness. And the result is that the Russians would only need a much smaller proportion of ultra-high-end technologies, which, to be clear, they do have, to keep producing their weapons, because they know how to use effectively legacy technologies that they already have. So a typical Russian cruise missile will have microchips of a kind that is still manufactured, but which were originally developed in the 1980s, and they will have more advanced chips for other applications developed in more recently, say in the 2000s, and they will use a very small number of more advanced technologies, not necessarily chips, which will bring the weapon system up to date. American weapons don't work in that way. On the subject of chips, by the way, I saw today a very interesting article in the Financial Times, which tells us that China is now on the cusp of next generation chip production, despite US curbs. And we go on to read that SMIC and Huawei plan to make 5nm processor, make a new 5nm processor supporting Beijing's goal for advanced semiconductors. And China's national chip champions expect to make next generation smartphone processors as early as this year. The country's biggest chip maker, SMIC, has put together new semiconductor production lines in Shanghai to mass produce chips designed by technology giant Huawei. The plan supports Beijing's goal of chip self-sufficiency, with President Biden administration tightening export restrictions for advanced chip making equipment. And then the article goes on to make claims that SMIC has managed to do this by using its existing stock of US and Dutch-made equipment to produce more miniaturized 5nm chips. The production line will make Kirin chips designed by Huawei's high silicon unit and destined for new versions of its premium smartphones. And while 5nm chips remain a generation behind the current cutting-edge 3nm ones, the move would show China's semiconductor industry is still making gradual progress despite US export controls. Now, I should say that there's a lot of assumptions behind all of this. I'm no doubt that the Chinese are going to produce or mass produce 5nm chips fairly soon, but there's an awful lot of assumptions that Chinese production lines really are based on reused Dutch and US equipment of a previous generation. It's a comforting thought for Westerners to believe, but of course there's no independent corroboration of it, at least none that I've seen. And we've no idea, at least I don't know, how the Chinese are able to mass produce chips of this kind using equipment that wasn't designed to produce them. I'm just saying. But the key point to take from this is that if the Chinese are going to start mass producing 5 nanometer chips, these are far more advanced than chips that are needed for pretty much all military applications. And if the Russians have need for 5 nanometer chips to develop their missiles, well, as of next year, with mass production of 5 nanometer chips in China, they should have no difficulty buying them. Huawei, which has of course designed these chips, is already a sanctioned company. So it would lose nothing by re-exporting 5 nanometer chips to Russia. I've, by the way, on this topic, read a very, very interesting outline of Russia's own plans for chip production, but I'm not going to discuss it in this program. Anyway, there we go. So, no reason to think that the military situation is going to improve. Political chaos in Kiev, and my own sense, by the way, going back to that earlier commentary from that source, is that the West is indeed heading towards thinking, or at least the United States is indeed heading towards thinking about an insurgency war against Russia in Ukraine, disastrous though that will be. Well, this ends my program today. Tomorrow I will return to the Middle East. I've seen the first article in National Review criticizing the Biden administration's allegedly weak response to Iranian provocations. It's exactly what I expected will happen. There's a lot more news from Germany. The head of the BDI, Germany's business union, has now openly criticized the German government's economic policies. But as I said, I will be discussing that in more detail tomorrow. This is where I finish. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Just to remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can buy amazing things like magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, all those great things. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And of course, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. It's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.